You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 339, The Treaties of Hopewell. Over the last few episodes, we covered several treaties that freed up land in western New York, western Pennsylvania, western Virginia, and the territory north of the Ohio River, all of which made way for western expansion. This provided new lands for settlers from the northern states. Some of it would be sold to fund the Continental Congress and pay off war debts. Other land would be used to provide promise grants to veterans of the Revolutionary War. Of course, the southern states faced a similar challenge and opportunity. With the war at an end, settlers from the southern states wanted to push further west into those lands as well. These lands, of course, were claimed by various native tribes, including the Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw. In 1785, the Continental Congress appointed 5 commissioners to negotiate terms with these southern tribes. 2 of the commissioners, Daniel Carroll of Maryland and William Perry of Delaware, ended up refusing the appointments, so we won't talk about them. Those who did accept were Andrew Pickens, Benjamin Hawkins, and Joseph Martin. Andrew Pickens was born in Pennsylvania. Now, his family had moved to Virginia and then to South Carolina while he was still a child. In 1764, as a young man, Pickens established a plantation, which he would eventually name Hopewell, in western South Carolina, near the border with Georgia. Pickens was already an experienced Indian fighter, having served in the Anglo-Cherokee War of 1760-61. Just across the Kiowa River from the Hopewell plantation was the Cherokee town of Seneca, which the Georgians just called Seneca. The town had been established centuries earlier and was a pretty sizable economic center for the Cherokee. While the Cherokee were at peace for the moment, Pickens did build a blockhouse on his property for future defensive needs. I've mentioned many of Pickens' exploits during the war in previous episodes. He rose to the rank of brigadier general during the Revolution, fighting in numerous battles against both the British and their Cherokee allies. He was captured at Fort 96 and wounded at Eutaw Springs. Towards the end of the war in 1782, after the British had withdrawn back to Charleston, Pickens remained active fighting Loyalists in Cherokee along the western border of the state. Over that fall, the militia attacked and destroyed a number of Cherokee villages, killing any warriors that they found. Pickens also traveled to a meeting at Augusta in Georgia in October, where officials negotiated a treaty with the Cherokee. Those negotiations took 5 months, resulting in the Treaty of Long Swamp, sometimes called Long Swamp Creek, in 1783. In that treaty, the Cherokee gave up claims to what is today northern Georgia, as well as part of western South Carolina. This included giving up their claims to Seneca, that town that was across the river from Pickens' plantation. The Cherokee had already given up a large amount of land following the Cherokee War of 1777, and this action seemed to be an additional land grab. But since the Cherokee had been quite hostile to the Americans during the war and had been allies of the British, many saw this as fair retributions for their actions. Many Creek and Cherokee factions rejected the terms of the treaty, but Georgia and South Carolina considered it binding. When the British evacuated Charleston at the end of 1782, Pickens was elected to the South Carolina legislature. He also devoted time to rebuilding his Hopewell plantation, which had been largely destroyed during the war. In the spring of 1784, the Cherokee complained that there were settlers moving into some of the lands that had been claimed actually by both Georgia and South Carolina. This set off a border dispute between the two states that would last for years. The other concern was that these illegal settlements could result in another Indian war. In 1785, Pickens had completed work on a larger mansion at Hopewell, and he received word of his appointment from Congress to establish a new treaty with the Indians. Congress also appointed Benjamin Hawkins, a leader from North Carolina. Raised on the frontier, Hawkins spoke several Indian languages. He had also attended the College of New Jersey at Princeton. The Revolution began while Hawkins was still in college, and he joined the Continental Army before graduation and served as a French interpreter for George Washington. In 1777, after the arrival of Lafayette, Hawkins found that there was much less need for his ability to interpret French, and his services were no longer required. He returned to North Carolina and was elected to the state House of Representatives. He then represented his state in the Continental Congress from 1781 to 1783. Upon reaching Congress's 3-year term limit, Hawkins returned to the North Carolina legislature. He was serving in the legislature when he received Congress's appointment to serve on the commission to establish a new treaty with the Indians. The third member of the commission, Joseph Martin, came from a Virginia planter family. Joseph was drawn to frontier life at the age of 16 when he ran away from an apprenticeship to join the fight to capture Fort Pitt during the French and Indian War. Following the war, he remained on the frontier, where he worked as a surveyor, fur trader, and land speculator. He received a rather large land grant in southwestern Virginia, near what is today the Kentucky border. Part of this region was disputed between Virginia and North Carolina. During this time, before the Revolutionary War began, there were numerous Indian uprisings and raids, giving Martin considerable experience as an Indian fighter. On several occasions, Indian attacks forced him off his land, only to see him return a short time later. He built several defensive forts, known as Martin's Station. After the death of his first wife, Martin married a half-Cherokee wife with whom he had 2 children. In 1777, Governor Patrick Henry appointed Martin as Virginia's superintendent for Indian affairs. He managed to keep the local Cherokee neutral during much of the war, though at times some of these smaller tribes did participate in attacks in coordination with the British and Loyalists in the region. By the end of the war, Martin was well established as an Indian agent as well as a speculator in Western lands. Much of his time following the end of the war was trying to restrain settlers in the self-proclaimed state of Franklin from retaliatory raids against the Cherokee, which threatened to set off another war. The 3 committee members met and agreed to hold treaty negotiations at Pickens's plantation at Hopewell. Trouble arose, however, from Georgia. These negotiations, under the authority of the Continental Congress, threatened to call into question Georgia's Treaty of Long Swamp Creek that had been concluded earlier. Georgia saw this congressional commission as an infringement on the state's sovereign authority. Georgia appointed Lachlan McIntosh and Elijah Clark to survey and establish Georgia's borders as Georgia saw it in the Treaty of Long Swamp Creek before the Congressional Commission could meet and decide anything differently. In an attempt to smooth over any hard feelings, Congress added McIntosh to the commission, and so he served along with Pickens, Hawkins, and Martin. McIntosh, of course, is also someone we covered many times before in earlier episodes. The Scottish native had immigrated to Georgia with his family as a young boy. His father died only a few years later in a conflict with the Spanish. McIntosh was raised in Savannah in an orphanage. As a teenager, he moved to Charleston, where he worked as a clerk for Henry Lawrence. After that, he moved to the Georgia frontier, where he worked as a surveyor and acquired a sizable rice plantation. When the Revolution began, McIntosh had already proven himself to be a patriot and a military leader. As a colonel in the Georgia militia, he repelled a British assault on the Savannah River in 1776. Shortly afterward, he received an appointment as a brigadier general in the Continental Army. McIntosh also had a political conflict with Button Gwinnett, who also wanted a commission in the Continental Army. After McIntosh received the appointment, Gwinnett went to serve in the Continental Congress, and shortly after that, he returned to Savannah and became involved in state politics. After the death of the president of Georgia, Gwinnett assumed that office himself. Gwinnett and McIntosh fought over a great many things. The fighting got deeply personal and eventually resulted in a duel where McIntosh killed Gwinnett. Following the duel, General Washington pulled McIntosh north to prevent possible retaliation against him by Gwinnett's political allies. McIntosh commanded Fort Pitt, which was on the western frontier at the time, and during this time he established Fort McIntosh on the Ohio River. He ended up returning south for the defense of Charleston in 1780 when he was taken prisoner. When he returned to his plantation after the war, he found it destroyed by the British. He was broke and struggled to rebuild his home. Georgia elected him to the Continental Congress, but he could not afford to go. The following year, 1785, he received that survey appointment to measure the Georgia border pursuant to the Treaty of Longbridge Swamp, and then he received this appointment by Congress to serve on the Treaty Commission. Now, the largest group of Indians in the region were the Creek. The commissioners attempted to open negotiations with the Creek, but found it very difficult. At the time, the Creek Confederacy was headed by Alexander McGillivray, also known as Hopewell Hilly Miko. His father had been a Scottish trader who had married his mother, Sahoy Marchand, a Creek woman who herself had a father who was a French trader. McGillivray had grown up in one of his father's large plantations in Augusta. When he got older, he went to school in Charleston and served as an apprentice to a trading company. He seemed headed for a career as a wealthy Southern merchant. The Revolution, however, changed everything. McGillivray's father was a staunch loyalist who returned to Scotland when the war began. In 1777, Alexander, who also remained a loyalist, moved west to live with his mother's family among the Creek. He received a commission in the British Army during the war, but did not really do much fighting. He worked more as a diplomat for the Creek. Given his lack of experience living among the Creek, it's not entirely clear how he came to lead them. His hatred of the Americans, combined with his wealth and education, certainly made him stand out. He couldn't even speak Creek very well, though. He continued to live as a colonial planter, and he ended up building 2 plantations for himself in what is today Alabama. When Chief Emistigo was killed in an attempt to relieve the British garrison at Savannah in 1782, McGillivray became the principal spokesman for the relatively disorganized Creek. When Georgia began compelling the Cherokee to cede lands in 1783, McGillivray reached out to the British at St. Augustine for help. The British responded that the war was over and that they were getting ready to turn over St. Augustine to the Spanish. They provided a little ammunition, but they essentially told him that the Creek were on their own. McGillivray next attempted to reach out to Spanish authorities, looking for a new ally. In May 1784, McGillivray and other Creek leaders met with Spanish officials in Pensacola. They agreed to put the Creek Confederacy under the protection of Spain in exchange for aid and support against the Americans. At the time, Spain was more concerned over its control of the Mississippi River. It saw keeping the Creek as a buffer between westward advancing Americans as it being in Spain's interests. In return, the Creek had the support of a powerful ally who could provide them with military support. So when the American commissioners came calling, the Creek were in no mood to sign any treaty. They asserted land claims as far north as modern-day Tennessee and disputed most of the territories that the Americans had claimed in recent years. With the Creek unwilling to negotiate, the commissioners abandoned the effort and moved on to the Cherokee. The Cherokee arrived at the Hopewell plantation in November of 1785. Groups of families arrived over several days, totaling nearly 1,000 people. Over the next few days, Cherokee leaders discussed terms with the commissioners. The final treaty established specific boundaries for Cherokee land and what lands would be open for settlement. Both sides would have the authority to punish or remove trespassers who settled illegally on their territory. It also required both sides to return any prisoners, including slaves and any other property that had been taken during the war. The Cherokee also had to recognize that the United States was the sole protector of the region, not Spain, not Britain. Only the U.S. Congress would have exclusive power to regulate trade with the Cherokee. Most Cherokee leaders rejected the treaty terms. They noted that there were already 3,000 settlers from the state of Franklin that had settled inside Cherokee territory and that the U.S. had done nothing about it. Because Congress refused to recognize the state of Franklin or do anything about the settlers, the Cherokee ended up signing 2 more treaties. They negotiated the Treaty of Dumpling Creek with President John Sevier of Franklin a few months earlier, and they would agree to the Treaty of Coyote in 1786, which ceded even more lands in what is today East Tennessee to the state of Franklin. Quite a few of the Cherokee, however, realized that they could not continue in a state of war with the U.S. So while many leaders refused to sign the treaty, several dozen of them did sign it. The commissioners considered this treaty binding on all Cherokee. It was the tradition to provide gifts at such treaty ceremonies. Of course, when nearly 1,000 Cherokee demanded gifts, the commissioners had to scramble to accommodate them, and this nearly exhausted their funds. In the end, the commissioners decided to dismiss their security detail in order to save some money. As the Cherokee departed in late November, the Choctaw delegation was on its way to Hopewell. The Choctaw delegation's travels were delayed when Creek Indians seized most of their horses, forcing them to travel the rest of the way on foot. In the end, a group of 127 men and women arrived at Hopewell in late December. Now, two of the commissioners didn't think the Choctaw were going to arrive when they did, so Commissioners Martin and McIntosh had already left Hopewell. They were able to get word to Martin, but McIntosh would miss the negotiations entirely. The Choctaw also requested gifts of food and new clothes before they would proceed with negotiations. Pickens also invited the leaders who had arrived in time to share Christmas dinner with him. After the gifts and some ceremonial events, the two sides began discussions. The final treaty would contain many of the same terms that we saw with the treaty with the Cherokee. The Choctaw would have to recognize the United States as the sole protector of the Choctaw. Both sides would return any prisoners and property from the late war. Both would be permitted to protect their territories from others who settled there illegally. The borders of the Choctaw Territory essentially forced the tribe to cede about 70,000 acres to the United States. Part of the lands the U.S. affirmed belonged to the Choctaw were actually controlled by the Creek, and the U.S. were not going to be any help with the Choctaw attempting to assert their claims to that land. That was a matter between the Choctaw and the Creek. In addition, the U.S. claimed 3 tracts of land inside Choctaw Territory where they could set up trading centers. The Choctaw leaders generally accepted the terms and agreed to them. They were much more focused on establishing trade relationships within South Carolina. The Choctaw, remember, had fought the Spanish alongside their British allies during the war, and so they had a really poor relationship with Spain. With Britain now gone, the Choctaw hoped that a better trading alliance with the United States would help them against their continued rivalry against the Spanish. So the commissioners and the Choctaw leaders finalized their treaty on January 3rd, 1786, and after that, the Choctaw returned home. Now, just as the Choctaw delegation was leaving, the Chickasaw delegation arrived in Hopewell, and this was an even smaller group, only a few dozen people. Now, once again, the final terms were very similar to the 2 other treaties, marking out the boundaries of land reserved for the Chickasaw and ceding other lands to the U.S. The Chickasaw would also recognize the U.S. as the sole power over their lands, but would retain the power to deal with any illegal settlers on their land. They would, again, deliver up prisoners or property. The Continental Congress would regulate all trade with the Chickasaw and would also establish a trading post on their territory. Like the Choctaw, the Chickasaw were longtime allies of the British who had fought against the French and Spanish for generations. So with the British gone, the Chickasaw really had to rely on the U.S. to assist them with any Spanish aggression. Chickasaw negotiators questioned the provision for the return of any American prisoners or property since they said they had none. They allowed the provision to remain because they essentially considered it meaningless. 3 Chickasaw leaders signed the final treaty on January 10th, after which the delegation returned home. Along the way, several war parties of renegade Cherokee attacked the Chickasaw and stole their property. The local Cherokee chief, fearing that this would blow back on him, actually went after the stolen property and returned it to Hopewell. The chief also offered his apologies that those responsible for the thefts had managed to escape and could not be turned over. Now, it seems that many Indians were trying to play both sides off against each other. Just over a year earlier, both Choctaw and Chickasaw negotiators had signed treaties with Spanish officials in Pensacola, which acknowledged that Spain had sole power over their lands and also controlled them from trading with others. The congressional delegation also had problems ensuring that they could keep their side of the treaty. Georgia continued with its contention that the Continental Congress had no authority to negotiate treaties on their behalf and that they would not be held to any such agreements. North Carolina also refused to support these treaties. In fact, several years after this, the state legislature would pass a bill declaring these treaties null and void and upholding state land grants to lands that had been reserved for the Indians under these treaties. Now, despite these challenges, the commissioners delivered the treaties to Congress, which then approved the trading posts with these tribes and considered the matter closed. Next week, we're going to head to Virginia, where they pass the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, John Salentano, and Michael Mulhern. Thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Greg Pusak, and 10 Crucial Days. And thanks also to new standard bearer Mary Rosewater, who joined on Patreon last month. Like everyone who joins at the $10 level or higher, Mary will receive a magnet each month with a different flag from the American Revolution. I also want to thank Paul Kallenberger for a one-time gift last month via PayPal. Now, before I get into this week's discussion, I just want to note the passing of author and friend of the show, James Kirby Martin. Jim passed away just over a week ago. I had the privilege to interview him on this podcast regarding Saratoga, and I also ran into him at several American Revolution conferences. In addition to being an expert on the Revolution, Jim was just a wonderful guy, always willing to help out people getting started in history, and a friend to just about everyone he met. We will all miss him, and we wish his family our sympathies. Now, this week, we took a look at the first post-war treaties with Indian tribes in the South. Now, unlike many of the northern tribes, which largely remained neutral between British and Patriots, the southern tribes were much more aligned with the British. The Cherokee went all out in war with the southern colonies early in the war and only pulled back when they were defeated militarily. And many of these southern tribes were also very active against the Spanish, relying on British-occupied Floridas for support. When the British withdrew from the region entirely by ceding East and West Florida to Spain, these tribes were left without any real support. Even so, these tribes continued to fight with each other and continued to fight with both Spain and the new United States. From the settlers' perspective, the continuation of attacks and raids only increased the anti-native sentiment and the desire to push these tribes further west. Today, we often look back on this ongoing situation with the benefit of hindsight, and we often see the natives only as victims. But when we remember the brutal attacks that the settlers suffered with regularity, one can at least understand the animosity that led to these policies. I also touched on the issue of the states being unwilling to cede these negotiations to the Confederation Congress. Many realized that the states needed to have a coordinated policy, and that was only really going to be possible through the Confederation. But so many state leaders were not confident that Congress would not sell out their interests. So this conflict would continue. The Constitution would explicitly give treaty-making power to the federal government. But even after that, we will see states defying federal powers on this matter and dealing with many issues on their own. Years after these negotiations concluded, Andrew Pickens would go on to serve in the Constitutional Convention and would also briefly serve in the House of Representatives. While there, he was a notable opponent of the Washington administration and its policies. There are today Pickens counties named after him in Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama. Benjamin Hawkins would continue to work as an Indian agent for the Continental Congress for many more years. He would become one of North Carolina's first U.S. senators. Several years later, President Washington would appoint him as Superintendent of Indian Affairs. He would go on to play a critical role in U.S. policy towards the Indians for decades. Hawkinsville, Georgia, and Hawkins County, Tennessee, are both named after him. Joseph Martin also served as an Indian agent for many years, but was eventually forced out of that position because he was seen as too friendly to Indian interests. Martin remained on the periphery of politics, holding several state and local offices, and Martinsville, Virginia, is named after him. Lachlan McIntosh continued to have money troubles. He mostly stayed out of politics after the war. Two of his descendants, James McIntosh and John McIntosh were both generals in the Civil War, but fought on opposite sides. McIntosh County in Georgia is named in his honor. The U.S. would eventually break all of these treaties that were signed at Hopewell as demand for Western lands put more pressure on these areas reserved for the tribes. Interestingly, the treaty with the Cherokee included a provision that the tribe had the option to send a representative to Congress. Although this was not used, it was repeated later in the Treaty of Choctaw in 1835. Based on those treaties, several Cherokee entities have attempted to send a non-voting delegate to the U.S. Congress in recent years, the most recent effort being in 2022. So far, Congress has refused to seat these proposed delegates. My book recommendation this week is Benjamin Hawkins, Indian Agent by Merritt Pound. Since most of Hawkins' life involves diplomacy with the native tribes of this region, this book gives a good overview not only of the Hopewell treaties, but of the subsequent treaties with the southern tribes. And this is an older book, first published in 1951. You can borrow a copy on archive.org if you just want to take a look at it. The author was a political science professor at the University of Georgia, but if you do want to read more on this topic, get a copy of Benjamin Hawkins, Indian Agent. My online recommendation is called Alexander McGillivray, The Last King of the Creeks. I only mentioned McGillivray pretty much in passing in the main episode. He was the one who led the Creek Nation for many important years after the war. Since the Creeks refused to sign the treaty during these years, I didn't give much attention to him, but the Creeks were the major Indian power in the South and would become more relevant to U.S. settlers as they pushed further into their lands. Because McGillivray was raised in the white man's world, he left a great record of letters and other writings that give her perspective on these events. He would eventually sign a treaty with the U.S. in 1790, and that treaty gave him quite a few personal benefits, including a substantial amount of money and a commission as a brigadier general in the U.S. Army. McGillivray would repudiate that treaty just 2 years later, and he died only a year after that. This look at his life is a pretty short look. It is, I guess, published as a book, but it's only 31 pages long, so think of it more as a lengthy pamphlet. Still, it's a work that was published in 1903, and it gives a good overview of his life. There are newer and more lengthy books about him if you want to get into more details, but if you just want an overview of McGillivray's life, you can take a look at this one. As always, I've included direct links on my blog and website. My question this week asks, in the episode where you talked about Lafayette's visit to America in 1784, you mentioned that he gave a lecture on animal magnetism in Philadelphia. What was that all about? Well, when Lafayette visited America, he was a celebrity because of his leadership during the Revolutionary War and because he had become the face of the alliance with France. Now, of course, Lafayette was more than that. Like many men of his time, he considered himself a Renaissance man who was interested in science and a great many other subjects, not just war. Animal magnetism was a new scientific theory that had caught Lafayette's attention. In 1779, a German doctor named Franz Anton Mesmer published a book describing his theory of animal magnetism. Essentially, Mesmer believed that there was an invisible force, a sort of unseen fluid that emanated from the bodies of all animals, including humans, and from the stars. Mesmer believed that he could control this force through the use of magnets, and that by moving the magnets over the human body, he could cure various illnesses and maladies. Part of the process involved putting the patient into a trance and then using magnets on the body. As you might guess, Mesmer's theories came under attack almost immediately by the medical community. They accused him of being a medical charlatan. Because Mesmer had claimed some real-world success using his methods, he pushed for further study, including taking 2 test groups of sick people, one getting traditional methods and the other getting Mesmer's treatment. The medical establishment refused to participate. Mesmer then approached Queen Marie Antoinette. Eventually, the king ordered 2 government commissions set up in 1784 to investigate the matter, and these were big-deal commissions. Benjamin Franklin sat on one of them. The result was that Mesmer's theory of animal magnetism was being widely discussed in France and much of the rest of Europe in the early 1780s, which is why it was of interest to Lafayette as well as the scientific community in Philadelphia. That is why Lafayette gave the lecture to the American Philosophical Society in 1784. In the end, both of the commissions were critical of Mesmer's practices, although they admitted that some cases did seem to benefit from them. Despite the criticism, animal magnetism, which later became known as mesmerism, became a popular form of alternative medicine, which reached well into the 19th century. Today, the theory and treatments have been forgotten and are considered useless. Many believe the benefits that we're seeing were the result of mesmerizing the patient or putting the patient into a hypnotic state and then encouraging the patient to heal himself. This aspect of mesmerism, which we today call hypnosis, is still used in certain circumstances by the medical community. Also, the modern use of magnets as a form of pain therapy has been approved for use by the FDA. So while Mesmer's claims were largely disproven, there may have been something to some of the methods that he was using. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on Twitter, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.